Good morning and a very warm welcome to this Friends of Europe online debate on how do we ensure we create a coherent voice on and a coherent policy on food systems and sustainable food systems in that. Before I say any further, let me just say a few words about the rules of the game. Those of you on Zoom, please make sure your video's on, your title's there, and to be muted. When you have an opportunity to raise a question or you want to actually engage with this debate, just use your virtual hand, which is by the iParticipants icon. Press that, and then that tells me that you want to come in, and we'll make sure that we can get as many of you as possible into this dialogue and discussion. We also have a live stream audience and welcome those of you who are there. Just use hashtag FOE debate to engage, and we'll try and take as many of you if you can, if you want to raise a question or a query. So that's the rules of the game. One final point, however, please do use a Zoom chat. The important thing there is that we are able to document your views and thoughts, but also you're able to chat with each other on the Zoom chat. It's a very useful resource, but also you can post ideas, resources and links for the colleagues in this virtual room. So, aligning voices for a sustainable food system. Those of you who have been following the politics of the common agricultural policy will know that the dust has landed on it to a certain extent after 2.5 years. You have the CAP, which reflects old thinking, and then you have the new Green Deal, which is new thinking. And there seems to be an ambition gap between what is required, what needs to be done, and actually in politics of the day. You know the facts and figures in this regard. Let me just remind you that basically we have agriculture is responsible for 10% of the EU's total greenhouse emissions. What we also know is that the EU's agricultural emissions have increased since 2012 and are expected to fall less than 5% between 2017 and 2030. Now go figure when you compare that to the actual targets being set for 2030 and 2050 by the Commission. We also know from the European Court of Auditors that despite 100 billion being earmarked for tackling climate change in agriculture, we've seen hardly any change in the reduction of emissions since 2010. That is stark. It's really stark. And what we do know globally, that more than half the world's total GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature. So on the one hand, it's absolutely essential, nature and agriculture. And we also know that we need to reinvent how we relate to nature and agriculture. Yet in the European Commission and the European Commission, what we've heard now is a great ambition on the Green Deal, a real desire to hardwire everything we do around tackling, mitigating and adapting to climate change, and yet a third of the EU's budget, which goes to CAP, remains in the old world and not tackling climate change. So we have a range of speakers for you. We have a range of politicians to respond to this as well. So firstly, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Koko Warner, who's from the IPCC, one of the authors. Warm welcome to you, Koko.
Thank you. So glad to be here with Friends of Europe, and hello, everyone.
Hello. Thank you for being with us. So, Koko, why should we consider climate change more when planning for sustainable food systems for the future?
Great. Thanks, Dharmendra. This is a quite remarkable decade, not least because of the pandemic, but also because of the chances ahead of us and the consequences of missing those windows of opportunity. So the main idea that I want to convey to all of you from the IPCC special report on climate change and land that came out in 2019 is that with the growing pressures of climate change, a focus on sustainable land management to prevent land degradation is a leading policy solution identified in this special report of the IPCC. So why is sustainable land management needed in the agricultural sector in the face of climate change? Well, I'm going to name 3 big challenges that we have. And Dharmendra, building on some of the things that you just said, agriculture, forestry, and other types of land use currently worldwide account for 23% of global greenhouse gas emissions. That does include transportation, of food and transportation within the agricultural sector, but that's a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions. Land is also a leading opportunity for absorbing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. So we know that trees and plants, grasses, flowers are a tremendous asset for our fight against climate change, which presents an existential threat for many life forms, including not in terms of extinction, but it's a real threat to society. So that's the first thing. Second, land is already under growing human pressure, and climate change is adding to those pressures. We could talk a lot about that. And third, almost philosophically, land must remain productive in its diversity of functions. Ecosystems are a storage for water that society needs to exist in the places that it does. Land, of course, is the thing on which we grow our food. And farmers are right at the forefront of managing soils. Soils contain so much more. It's not just a natural resource, it's a whole form of life that we depend upon in itself. But there are limits to the contribution of land as a way to sequester carbon, to produce food, to grow biofuels. That might also be part of the solution. And so really wisely managing land is an essential component of addressing climate change and making sure that society is resilient, making sure that people all over the world have enough food to eat, and I could go on. So what's at stake for Europe and other regions of the world at this moment in time is with this window of opportunity to reshape policy in the direction of policy. This is really a tremendous opportunity to ensure all of those top priorities politically, to make sure people are well fed and safe and all of those things, as well as to tackle some of these greatest challenges of climate change. There are three things that could be considered. And again, this comes from this special report on climate change and land, sustainable land management. And this includes, I'm just going to name a few, no-till agriculture. That's a real departure from the past. In the past, tractors and tilling up the soil may have been considered quite modern. Science is showing that tilling the soils degrades the microbiomes in the soils. It greatly fosters erosion 100 times more quickly than the rate at which soils are actually formed, reducing the chemical burden, and also leaving crop residues and organic material on the soil. Again, that reduces evaporation. It increases the nutrient content of soil and prevents erosion. So that's one thing. Risk management can also enhance the ability of those who are actually producing food to do so in a sustainable way and also to keep their livelihoods in focus. We're also going to need to watch communities. Increased risks of flood, extreme storm, extreme winter, extreme heat make sustainable land management more important than ever. Cities need trees. Cities need cool areas where there is green, not only for that greening and water storage effect, but also so that people living in those cities have a place where they can be with to get out of the heat. And then third, reducing inequalities. That social aspect is often overlooked in big policies, but the pandemic has really showed that reducing inequalities, maintaining social cohesion is an absolutely essential part of all policies. Imposing things on people that are expected to enact those policies often doesn't work. So you may have a beautiful policy on paper, but if you don't bring those people along, give the affected people a voice, involve them in policy formation, the policy has as research is showing, policy has a less good chance of being successful if it's not inclusive, if attention isn't given to reducing inequalities. So really the call to action coming from the IPCC special report on land and climate is policies that support sustainable land management, ensure the supply of food for vulnerable populations, and keep carbon in the ground while reducing greenhouse gas emissions That package is the promise for the future.
Koko, thank you as ever. Very clear explanation of what the issues are. From your perspective, and perhaps I know this is a challenging question, and you may say, actually, no, thank you. That's for a politician. Do you get a sense that people are moving with pace? Because you sit in this interesting place at the IPCC and UNFCCC, you can see stuff that's happening. Do you get a sense, there's a sense of urgency in the policymakers on this agenda, given that, this agenda affects our species fundamentally? We can see that, intensive farming is going to have a huge impact on, biodiversity, etc., and so forth, and therefore, future diseases, etc., and so on. Do you get the sense that we are moving with the right pace?
I'll mention the optimistic things that I see, and then perhaps some opportunities for growth in the future. So, before the pandemic, you had youth and grandparents and citizens of all stripes and shapes out on the streets in areas like Europe. I also live in Europe, although I'm not from here. And that raised awareness, and it really raised the bar. You won't hear, if you're brushing your teeth in the morning, listening to the radio, you won't have a news cycle that doesn't include climate change. And that's, I think, tremendously important, that people are aware that what we do as a society together affects our opportunities in the future. That's incredibly important, also because of that inclusiveness that I mentioned a minute ago. Policy is not yet keeping pace. I think we're seeing in different parts of the world. I come from the United States, and right now there is a historic heat wave parked in the Pacific Northwest. Usually this is a temperate, rather cool, rainy region. We have daytime temperatures approaching 50 degrees Celsius. It's really time to make sure that policy and the scale of policy aligns with the scale and temporal and spatial scale of risks that are starting to break upon us.
Koko, thank you. I will bring you in later, but thank you very much for setting the scene for this conversation and debate on how do we align voices for sustainable food systems. Okay, I'm going to shift our gaze and move to an entrepreneur from the farming field, someone who's done some amazing things across Europe. You've recently also, and I bet I'm going to get this wrong again, your name, Ivo, or it's Ivo, right? Or Ivo? Ivo? Ivo. Of course I'd get it wrong. Ivo, thank you for joining us. You've recently won the Google Challenge for impact, etc., innovation in this kind of areas of climate change and making sure that digital can be an accelerator. And you've done a number of things in terms of regenerative farming. And as I said in the beginning, we've probably seen one of the most significant backward steps in policy in terms of being able to create a transformative moment on agriculture by keeping the common agricultural policy as it is, or as it was in the past, and not up to pace. What do you need from the EU for your regenerative agriculture activities and approach to become a norm?
Thank you very much. Yes, we have obviously observed the CAP negotiations very closely, and it is an incredible challenge. I want to acknowledge to create such a piece of legislation that has an impact on so many lives and on really all of us. I think what is clear is that the agricultural sector, that any change in the agricultural sector is extremely sensitive. And I think this is something that the Council has taken into account in being very careful with changes. The CAP has maintained food security over a long time, and that is very important. At the same time, I think it is also clear that we are not doing ourselves a favor in stalling development, because if we do not act now, farmers will have to face very, very big changes that do not come from the legislative side, but really from the weather and climate side, that will affect them much more than any legislation that is about to come. So I think on the one hand, we have a very clear objective through the Green Deal to decarbonize the economy, to reach the net zero. And we do not have any way of doing that if we do not reduce emissions from agriculture and at the same time enhance its capacity to sequester atmospheric carbon. But on the other hand, we have a very clear objective, that is, we need to create a resilient agricultural sector that's actually able to cope with the changing weather patterns. Maybe, and we have that potential, maybe reduce the concentration of atmospheric carbon if we act quickly and decisively. So what we see is that we stand before a major overhaul of our most fundamental industry on the whole continent, because in the end, everything depends on agriculture. And within the next few years, we have to make changes which affect over 10 million farmers and livelihoods in highly diverse ecosystems and economic and social situations. If we're talking about southern Spain or whether we're talking about Denmark, we need completely different solutions. And I think what we have seen in change management in the private sector, but also in the public sector, is that such a change cannot be managed top down. We cannot manage a change of that magnitude. So this is something that we need to use the innovative power of our population, of our farmer population, of our entrepreneurial sector to make such a big change. And so what I would say with climate farmers, the way we understand ourselves is as prototyping policy for a regenerative agricultural sector. We see that to take big steps in such a central element as the CAP, it needs tried and tested mechanisms. So you can't take any risks with a mechanism like this. So what we are doing with climate farmers, we are running the risk, we are running the experiment to try out what kind of incentive systems would work to really incentivize change for farmers. And so what we're working with is a result-based approach, which gives farmers the chance to use their innovative power, to exercise their knowledge of the local context and make the changes that they need, because they understand that soil is central. They understand that their ecosystems are central, but right now they do not have the incentive system to create this. So in the same way as with climate farmers, we do that for farmers, where we give a result-based incentive system, testing that as a potential piece of legislation into the future. We also would like to encourage more open social innovation approaches from the European Union, and we see a lot of openness, and we welcome the openness that we see from the European Commission to work with bottom-up approaches to test innovation and then see how they can be implemented into legislation. So I think what I want to say is, what I want to encourage is the openness with a challenge that we have never faced before, to experiment and to develop mechanisms to allow to experiment, because we do not have the tools to cope with climate change because we have never faced it. So we will have to try things.
Specifically, we know that, there were systems being put into place into the CAP, like an ecosystem, like an a lever, which we know now it's voluntary, it's not mandatory, and national governments can do as they please around it, and there's really no accountability around it. What would you, quite specifically, what would make a difference? What specific measure would you like to help upscale your ambition? Because when you look around, the capacity for technology in terms of sensors to help soil degradation awareness, to do a whole range of things that could transform the life cycle of agriculture that I've seen in parts of the world, we don't seem to have made even an inroad into that. What kind of technological or other levers do you need to actually upscale your ambition from the European Union?
So I think it goes back to the point of a result-based approach. So we cannot prescribe farmers across Europe to undertake certain agricultural practices. We have tried this; it doesn't work, as you have said. So the eco schemes, in a way, take this into account by leaving that to the national government. But we know that this is not likely to make a difference. Instead of going a practice-based approach, we need a result-based approach, and we have a set of parameters that tell us whether or not an ecosystem is regenerating. Right, like we have things like improved soil health, water quality improvement, water quantity regulation, flood risk reduction. We have climate change mitigation through the storage of carbon in the ground, the conservation and enhancement of biodiversity. So we have all of these parameters, and we can measure them. And this is central. The technology is getting to a point where we can actually remotely, scalably, cheaply measure the outcome of these parameters, and therefore give farmers that feedback, whether or not they are reaching these objectives for the public, right? Like these are public goods. So these are things that farmers are helping the public with, and as a public, we can pay for these public goods. And so what we should be doing and what we are prototyping is to define these parameters, find ways of measuring them, and then give farmers very clear indicators, honestly, sort of within a certain range. But you are free to exercise your innovative power, your knowledge of the local context, to reach these goals that we have set. And we will support that through financial instruments that work for you in your local context. And this is something that will, because there's often this saying that the CAP makes taxpayers pay twice, right? That once it makes us pay as taxpayers for the subsidy, once it makes us pay on the counter. But actually it makes us pay three times. We pay once as a subsidy, once on the counter, but then we pay again for the externalized costs. I don't know the number for the whole European Union, but for Germany, there's a report by the Boston Consulting Group, which shows that we have over 90 billion externalized costs, 90 billion euros in externalized costs through the kind of agriculture that we incentivize through another big amount of money to happen. So if, on the other hand, we incentivize the internalized benefits by farmers, we have a potential to actually save money through the CAP while improving ecosystems and resilience of the farms.
Thank you so much for responding to that very specifically. And the reality is, though, at the end of the day, countries like Germany and France, etc., will just increase intensive farming, which we know that, because there isn't a sufficient. It doesn't seem to be the case that the economic cost and the climate challenge costs are being weighed up at all, and it's a real shame that the two are not seen in the way that they should be, as one leading the other. I'm going to take a political view. Two politicians in series. We have the Vice Chair of the European Parliament Committee on Agriculture and Rural Development, Francisco Guerreiro, who's going to tell us a little bit about his views on the subject matter, followed by César Luena, who's the Vice Chair of the European Parliament Committee on the Environment, Public Health and Food Safety. I'm going to take two politicians in a row. Can I just say to you all again, do raise your hands if you want to contribute or engage or have questions for the debate. So there we go. Can we first turn to Francisco? My apologies about the volume.
Local markets, local production and distribution, but also having the financial support to produce more organically. And so if we add up all these type of incentives and this way to go, we will obviously decrease our emissions in greenhouse greenhouse gases, will also have a better health, and obviously will help animal protection laws that are more effective. So I would say that the biggest priority for us right now will be for us to align all the treaties and all the regulations and directives so we could make this transition that is a climate transition, a social and animal welfare transition. Thank you very much for your time.
So clearly, a very specific view that we just need to up the game on this agenda, and it's evident from the politician that what there needs to happen is a better coherence in policy, because actually the stakes are too high. Let's move to César Luena, again, Vice Chair of the Parliamentary Committee on Environment, Public Health and Food Safety.
The recent CAP agreement represents a transition towards a more sustainable food system. Member States must see their actions taking also into account the Farm to Fork and the biodiversity strategies. Their objectives must be binding and set in legislation. These two strategies are the voice of the EU in the UN Food System Summit later this year, where I will highlight 3 points. We need that healthy and sustainable diets are facilitated. We need that all subsides that are harmful to environment and animal welfare are assessed as soon as possible with a view to their phasing out. We need to consume and produce within the limits of our planet. Sustainable food systems are a key tool to improve both our health and our environment.
So they're fairly clear set of issues outlined by the politician there. We have a question from John Makoha. John, very warm welcome to you. Please do introduce yourself and your question, please.
Thank you. Question, but also just, I'm not sure if it's a question, but more of adding up to some of the points that was mentioned by the previous speakers.
Thank you.
And what I see, some of these things we've talked about in the past, in trying to align the policy with what happens on the ground. My name is John Makoha. I work with AVSI. I'm a regional manager in Uganda, and we support a lot of farmer organizations and farmer groups. And in any way, the policies, the EU policies for farm to fork will certainly affect us. And they affect us because many of the policy directions that the EU chooses are some of the policies that our countries take up. Now, the most important aspect that I saw, and Koko mentioned it, that's the name, is the reducing the inequality. And in here we have, for example, in Uganda, almost close to 75% of our population are young people, women, young men, and these are mainly vulnerable groups. However, most of the approaches we've had in the past don't seem to address this group of people. They don't see their clear needs. And therefore, many of the good intentions are never realized. And for example, we've been rethinking what can we do with our extension systems. We have the traditional extension system that laid on a foundation that no longer works. And I have seen that also in some of the recent studies, trying to compare the coherences between the farm to fork strategy and the Africa's climate and food sovereignty agendas, these inequities still exist. Yeah. And I think that we will want to find a way, and somebody mentioned it also, a bottom approach mechanism, an openness that can allow us to link with these rural communities and rural structures that can help buy in these people on the ground. Otherwise, the policies are very good, they look nice, but we cannot be able to reach them on the ground. Some of the innovations, there have been recent innovations, private-public partnerships. However, they are not clearly envisaged in some of these policies, and sometimes we don't know where to fit them, and we don't know how they can be supported within the present mechanisms. I think these are some of the things that I think are critical. They look probably repeated all the time, each time we have had these policies, but they are never really addressed. And I think that in order to be able to address them, we need to find a mechanism that buys in the people on the ground, buys in their participation. A lot of discussions that goes on here, especially when we have the EU dialogues, remain at a certain level that doesn't allow this group of people and their ideas to be bought in. Thank you.
John, you make a really important point, especially when you think of the demographics in a country such as Uganda. It's absolutely essential that the kind of buy-in across generations, especially for the future generations, is key. What would make a difference in terms of the role that the EU has to play? Because we currently have a Africa-Europe Foundation. Agriculture is one of the areas that we're focusing on in one of our strategy groups. What is it that you need that might help shift what you're discussing, a bottom approach from the EU, if anything?
I think one of the most important things is listening to the civil society organizations. Okay. It is always mentioned, but it needs to be done probably in a very different way. I think we do it in a rush, and maybe we don't give it even an attention to it. And I know in the past, it has always been, it's international organizations versus local organizations. And yet some of the critical support to local organizations have come through international organizations. I think we need to go to the crust of this issue in terms of how do we buy in these civil society organizations? How do we allow their voice to run across the line of thinking that we are bringing in? Because the policies remain good, they remain supportive. However, that thin thread that cuts through binding us and lifting the young people. For example, you cannot improve the agricultural system in Uganda without having a critical link to the youth. They form 70, 80%. And many of them are beginning to migrate to Europe, to wherever, thinking that there is somewhere else where life will be easier. And yet, they could have a livelihood. We've seen, for example, we've had examples of young people that are able to do very simple things, including innovations in technology, and are able to have a livelihood out of it. I think this link of trying to get to the last mile of people is what we need to innovate.
John, thank you so much for bringing that perspective, but also experience and set of issues which are ultimately linked. The agricultural, life cycle, it's kind of completely cyclical with Africa and elsewhere in the world. It's globalization on a different way and a different level. Thank you for being with us. By the way, whereabouts in Uganda are you, incidentally? So you're muted.
I'm in Kampala, and right now we are under lockdown because of the present upsurge of the COVID-19.
Indeed.
But we continue to support
thank you for joining us from Kampala. It's very good to have you with us. Thank you. I'm going to go to Lorenzo now. Lorenzo, please introduce yourself and either your question or comment, please.
Yes, good morning to you all. Thanks a lot for the very interesting presentations and interventions. So I'm Lorenzo VanElsen. I work for the Belgian Foreign Trade Agency, and we just recently published a sectoral study called Belgian Sustainable Food Systems, in which we explain the pioneering role that Belgium plays in sustainable food systems. So the study is divided in three main parts. A first part, which provides an overview of the situation of the food sector in Belgium through the prism of sustainability. In the second part of our study, 12 innovative Belgian companies active in the food sector are interviewed. 12, why 12? Because as a country, as Belgium, we have 3 regions, so we have 4 companies per region that are interviewed. And the third and last part presents various stakeholders of the sector as well as a non-exhaustive list of Belgian companies active in this domain. I will share the link to our publication in the chat maybe after my brief intervention. The publication is can be freely downloaded, so it's entirely at your disposal, and you can contact me at any time if you have any questions on the study. Maybe one brief point I want to mention, and an important finding of the study is that as the world's leading food importer, the EU can also use its external policies, such as free trade agreements, to stimulate and encourage a global transition towards more sustainable food practices. And as a matter of fact, given the growing urgency to promote sustainability as a policy objective, the EU should and already does define sustainability as an explicit objective of its external policies, as I said, such as in its free trade agreements, and can negotiate relevant sustainability provisions in these agreements and also monitor the impact of such provisions on food system. And a question I can maybe ask to, I think there is a representative of the EU Commission, is how the EU uses its sustainable impact assessments to ensure that its free trade agreements promote food system sustainability. Okay, great.
Lorenzo, thank you very much for that perspective, and do share the link to your report on the chat. Thank you. I'm going to move to Christel. Christel, from you're the Director of Rural Development and Agriculture Division at the GIZ. Tell us, we have another very significant milestone coming up, which is the UN Food System Summit later this year. And as I said in the introduction, we seem to have a kind of an ambition gap. On the one hand, the European Green Deal that sets out a laudable vision and practice potentially, and a set of regulations, etc., to make us much more climate neutral and carbon reductive by the middle of the century. And then you have the CAP, so which is, as I said in the earlier part, old thinking and not really significant change. What do we need to do to create some form of unanimity or a coherent voice, one voice from the EU at the UN Food System Summit there later this year?
Okay, thank you for inviting me here to speak to you. I think the UN Food System Summit offers really a momentum for every country in the world to readjust policies and actions to achieve the SDGs. It chose a different approach compared to other summits of the UN. It aimed at including the broad public by collecting ideas for game-changing solutions which will help to transform our food systems and achieve the SDGs. Despite some criticism from civil society, the process has led to tremendous participation from around the world. More than 2,000 ideas were submitted, and the ideas are really experiences which are already implemented on the ground. So it is still possible to reach all 17 Sustainable Development Goals, but no country, no organization can do this on their own. So what is important for the UN Food System Summit is that they defined 5 action tracks. The first action track is ensure access to safe and nutritious foods for all. The second one is shift to sustainable consumption patterns. The third one is boost nature positive production, as Koko began at the beginning. The fourth one is advance equitable livelihoods, including living wages. And the fifth one is build resilience to vulnerabilities, shocks, and stresses. In the EU context, this means for policymakers to create a platform where stakeholders from different sectors meet and exchange. formulate pathways based on data and evidence for food system transformation, form coalitions, create an enabling environment, and raise expectations. And the EU, with the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork strategies, offers really a pathway towards more sustainable food systems or healthier diets. It's also important that we have the voluntary guidelines on food systems because they give a wide range of recommendations, and we should bring all this experience in the Food System Summit. And we did it. GIZ, for example, together also with EU, brought in, for example, the necessity to do assessments, to change needs facts and figures. And if we don't know where we stand, we don't know where we go. So we brought in this experience together in the solution tracks. And I think a lot of experience are there on the ground. What is important, and there I really join John, is that we look very carefully at the local levels, at the regional levels, and also at the national levels to make changes real. Thank you very much.
Christel, thank you very much. Clearly, you lay out the issues, but what's not clear is how that's going to make us much more coherent on the agricultural point in terms of the CAP and how we create a unified voice in moving this agenda forward. But let's take a view from the politician. We have Sarah Weiner, who's member of the Agricultural Rural Development Committee at the European Parliament.
Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm very pleased that you are discussing sustainable food systems today, as this is an enormously important topic that affects us all. Within the last 50 to 100 years, around 90% of our species and seeds diversity has been lost. Temperatures are rising and epidemics are increasingly likely. The coronavirus has shown us all just how quickly a pandemic can emerge. All of this proves that business as usual is no longer an option. What we need is a system change, a real turnaround in how we produce our food. In this context, the gap negotiated in the trialogue a few days ago is, let's say it, a disaster. It continues to promote the big players, the agro-industry, the fertilizer business, and harms small farmers, biodiversity, and the environment. And the so-called eco schemes are nothing more than an exercise in greenwashing. As shadow rapporteur of the Farm to Fork strategy in the European Parliament, I would like to thank the Commission for this ambitious strategy and plead for the timely implementation of these objectives. Yes, we need to reduce the use of pesticides by 50%, half of the use of antibiotics in livestock farming, and increase the share of organic farming to at least 25% of arable land. To achieve this, we don't need new technology like new genomic techniques for which it is not even clear how they will affect us and the ecosystem that we are part of it. Instead, we can make use of what is already there and don't need pesticides, for example, like ecological farming. Sustainable farming methods such as organic farming or agroforestry, permaculture, microfarming with multi-annual crop rotation that produce abundant yields and keep the soil fertile, strengthen Europe's small regions and strengthen togetherness. Even it is often difficult, I'm convinced that together we can achieve a real food turnaround.
There you have it from a green politician, clearly with very straightforward views on where we stand. I'm going to go straight to the European Commission now. We have Tassos with us, and it's a great timing here now, and also it's good to have you with us, Tassos. tell us, you've heard a lot about where people stand on this debate. You know where the CAP has landed. Is there still an opportunity to align the EU's agriculture and food sector with the European Green Deal? Because at the moment they feel miles apart.
Good morning, everybody. Well, I'm not sure if the timing is appropriate, because with the time I have available, it's going to be very hard to undo some of the damage that has already been done in the CAP without any discussion actually about what we're dealing with. First of all, let me come with your initial point on whether actually the CAP is old thinking and the Green Deal is new thinking. Then as a European Commission, we clearly would have a major problem, because we had already made a paper and a proposal that try to indicate where exactly the CAP and the Green Deal are going together. And I stress this point because I think it is important to move away of the old thinking, which was one that has led also to problems not only in the CAP but other types of policies, of pitting against each other economic and social development and environmental footprint. This is something that we have to change. So it is extremely important in the future, when we discuss the impact of policies, to actually try to see what has worked, what hasn't worked, and what needs to change in a concrete manner. Why do I raise that? Because we keep on saying that we live on one planet. This planet has the same dimensions, a much worse atmosphere than it had in the past, a population that keeps growing, and land that is not only deteriorating, but there is no available land more to produce food. So we need to find ways that solve a global problem in a global dimension. What can the European Union contribute in this dimension? Because our problems and the issues we discuss are not the same with the issues that John raised in Uganda. Our population has gone up by 7% in the European Union in the last 10 or 20 years. It's 70% in Africa. So we talk about very different things. The first thing that we have to be very clear, and I come to a point that was raised by Koko in the beginning, is essentially we have a paradox that we need to turn into a synergy. We don't have a soil directive in the European Union. And yet, most of the solutions we want to do and most of the leverage of the common agricultural policy is on practices that affect land management and have an impact on soil and in the soil. And that should be our starting point. And the starting point, and I claim here that in the CAP agreement that was made, that is clearly less ambitious than the proposal we made, but still moves further than we are today. The framework is there to use a different set of policy tools that would allow, in a situation that is very diverse, and I thank Ivo that raised this issue, to choose exactly the best practices that make sense where they make sense. And here, the other thing that we need to be clear is there is a very healthy competition among different practices that all can demonstrate that they can improve the environmental ambition, reduce the footprint, and increase economic efficiency. Whether it's conventional precision agriculture, organic, regenerative agriculture, agroecology, we have demonstrated that these examples exist. And why is this important? Because if we focus only on part of land management and focus our attention on these practices and forget about what happens in the rest, we might have the best climate-friendly, environmentally friendly islands in an environment that overall could deteriorate. That's why the starting point of our effort to change the common agricultural policy is to increase the level of ambition throughout what happens in all of land that goes to agriculture. And it's very important here to see that we have also the mechanisms that would allow us to measure much more concretely than in the past performance of the policy. And performance of the policy is not how much money we spend in one or the other policy instrument. You can have the same policy instrument, the same amount of money spent on farming with very different results, because the soil environment, is going to be different. The farmer advisory systems are going to be different. The management practices, the knowledge of the farmers are going to be different. And this is why we need to find ways of sharing knowledge among farmers and identifying the practices that work and the others that don't work. There is a whole list of best practices that our colleagues in the Joint Research Center have produced and made available to member states. It's based on all the scientific literature, and the scientific literature is not black and white. So we need to move away of these oversimplistic approaches. Let me come up very briefly, because I want to finish a little bit later with that, with what you mentioned before about all the money that we spend and we have done nothing in terms of climate or other things. Over the last 30 years, EU's agriculture is the only major agriculture in the world that reduced emissions. At the same time, we have stagnation. We had stagnation up until 2017. By the way, I'm the one that made this presentation at the Agricultural Outlook Conference in 2018. It's not a fact that we were hiding. But what we have done is also linked causality. And what is the causality? We have stagnation in emissions because production went up by 7%. The conditions that led to this are gone now. We don't have the huge demand on dairy products or the abolition of the dairy quotas that generated the transition. So we're slowing down, and in fact, we recover the previous path of slowing down emissions. But we do it in a manner that is below this very ambitious targets we have set. That's why we have to improve very concretely the manner by which we actually are going to meet these targets. And what we have to do affects three very clear dimensions. First of all, it affects the supply side. Most of the farmers are concerned about the impact of any additional environmental conditions in their cost of production. But we have technologies right now that indicate that you can reduce your cost of production by implementing it, provided, of course, that we find ways of sharing this information and this knowledge to farmers. Second, there is no way of achieving these targets if there is not a significant change in consumption patterns in all basic human needs, whether it's food, whether it's shelter, whether it's travel, energy, what have you. And many have mentioned this. And third, and also a very important issue, this is not something where we can do it alone. If it's a global problem, it requires global solutions. And here, when we actually share our knowledge to the rest of the world, we need to be very much aware about the type of issues and challenges that are common and the solutions we can have and share with them, and others that are very different, where other parts of the world would probably need to find different type of solutions to address the same type of problem.
Tassos, thank you very much for that, and thank you for responding to some of the points that were made. But responding to the question from the colleague about free trade agreements, are you using the sustainability impact assessment as a part of the FTAs?
We are using, and when we do analysis, we use these things. What is happening with analysis and assessments, especially impact assessments, is that there is one thing that you're doing when you do the analysis, and there is another thing where is the timing and the publication of these assessments. But yes, we are obliged actually to make proposals.
So that sounds like the fact that you do the analysis, but the agreement just goes ahead because the timing is mismatched.
No. I mean, when you do an analysis, the analysis is a contribution to the policy decision-making process. And that's what we do. Okay. Now, the policy decision-making process takes all sorts of considerations into account. Okay. And that is happening throughout all the world, and that's a political reality.
Sure. Tassos, I know that you're not answerable for this, but we've had a whole range of MEPs say how disappointed they are. We know in reality that there is a mismatch. However much you might say, we've seen the change, but I think the audience here and others will be reflecting on, and this is not your fault, how politics and vested interests has potentially played the game in this particular debate. But let's go to citizens. We have a question from our citizens panel. We have a Debating Europe, which is a panel of over 6 million people that engage on issues that matter to them in their lives and for Europe. So I have a very great pleasure in introducing my colleague Deborah, who has a question from our Debating Europe platform. Deborah.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Dharmendra. So yes, we have Laszlo, who says that while sustainable farming needs to be supported, food should stay easily affordable for everyone. If we want sustainable farming, the EU domestic market will need protection from the global market. Otherwise, it won't be competitive against cheap alternatives. And in long terms, that means that a risk of food security that is a must. What should you say to him? Thank you.
Deborah, thank you very much. I think well, we should, in effect, send him a lot of this debate, because it's very clear that the politics and the policy, but also the ambition, are not necessarily triangulated in this one. Let me go to, we have one final question from Thomas. Thomas Gauthier, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, hello, Thomas Gauthier-Lafaye from... Hello, Thomas Gauthier-Lafaye from Danone. Thank you very much for the conversation, very interesting. Maybe just two remarks, because I guess we couldn't agree more on the fact that soil will play a key role moving forward in terms of mitigating some of the climate change impact. So going back to Koko's point, yes, we need to add on the emissions, but we need to add on the sequestration as well. And very supportive of the need which were mentioned by Ivo on some of the pilot trials. I think one point which will need to be tackled one way or the other will be 2 points, basically. One will be on the policy asks. So we heard the Commission talking about soil directive. I think we could talk about accounting methodologies as well, because as soon as it gets down to carbon sequestration, we just need all to align on what will be the methodologies. But I guess one point which has not been mentioned to date is the cost of transitioning. I mean, whenever we have pilots with some of our farmers, one of the big challenge we have is who's going to help us within this transition. Because we know it works within the space of 18 to 24 months, at least some of the pilots that we trial, but who's going to accompany them? So we will, guaranteeing long-term contracts, etc. But there is a risk which will need to be borne by someone within the food chain for these pilots. We are having very constructive discussion with the European Commission on this guarantee of first loss, etc. But that will be a key pivotal point moving forward, which will need to be addressed in some way.
Thomas, thank you very much for making those points, and they're really essential. And I think that the solution obviously lies in more evidence-based thinking in policy, but let's see. I have another question. We're going to just go on for another 2 or 3 minutes, if you can be patient and generous with me and us in this conversation. We have Tatu. My apologies if I've pronounced your name wrongly. Do correct me.
It is perfect. My name is Tatu Liimatainen, and I work for a consultancy called Foretold. I also have, we do communication and PA consultancy, but personally I have also a bit of a background in the EU institutions. Okay. I see that the time is running out. There's been a very good discussion, but just I would like to maybe approach Tassos with a very concrete question. I mean, in general, the CAP is a big policy and the changes, they come slowly. And of course, the discussion is also intense, as we saw now a couple of weeks back. But I think there's a lot of criticism towards the policy, yes, but I think that the direction is right. And now I think that we have the policy agreed, we have the funding there, and we have the tools for these result-based systems. So my question to Tassos is that now with these concrete strategic plans, how is the Commission going to look after that this development is also going to happen in practice? So a very pragmatic and compact question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Tatu, I suppose it's quite interesting. I'm sure you have a few tales to tell from the inside out. As you say, you've been working with politicians and others within the Commission in this area, so it'll be interesting to know what your views are more so in terms of future discussions. But Tassos, over to you in response to that very specific question.
Yes, thank you very much for this question, which is also linked to the other ones. I mean, our starting point is the needs-based analysis of member states. And by the way, we made some recommendations to member states already. I don't think anybody has had any big doubts or disagreements on the basis of the analysis. So the next step now is we have an agreement, which is what it is. It's the legislation that we have in place. which is better to have it than not to have it. It's clearly less good with respect to the ambition we had, but we have to see whether the concrete measures and ambitions of the member states are going to go in the right direction. And for me, the big dilemma is, are we going to take a strategic approach on this, which is prioritize the basic needs in member states, which are different, by the way, and focus exactly on the policy measures that are necessary to address the negative situations and improve the overall ambition? Or are we going to spend our time debating against more, or whether one is good and the other is bad? We do have the capacity to measure some of the results. Soil impacts take time. If for anything that is worth my experience with previous CAP reforms, and this one is the following. Yes, the speed is important, but most important is to make the direction of change irreversible. Because time is not linear, and there is going to be a process whereby if people learn by what sometimes others are doing much better than what bureaucrats or politicians are telling them, there's going to be acceleration of the positive movement. And I think this is the most important thing, is to be able to explain to those that will have to implement these measures that some people have already started in this process and they have concrete results.
Tassos, thank you very much. And you know, it's a helpful perspective. But the one question that I have in my mind, which is not for you but for everyone, is that I wonder how much of an assessment has been made of the impact of the rapid change in the climate on this policy, and what might happen if we have a situation where we've seen the unpredictable rates and changes in weather. Imagine if we had either the drought and the kind of the heat that we have currently suddenly descend upon France and Germany, or we get the reverse. What does that do to the future of our farming? And I wonder how much of an assessment has been made of actually adapting our farming base and our farmers to that reality. On that point, I want to go to, and I'm going to wrap up now, move to a range. I think Koko would like to come in, which I'm more than happy to bring you in at this stage, Koko.
Yeah, thanks so much. Just very briefly, going back to the IPCC special report on land and climate, when it comes to soil, there is a point beyond which soils are so degraded that they're so degraded of organic content that they do not rebound. There are limits to what can be done after that point. And again, that's why from a science perspective, and echoing what many of you said, maybe particularly you, Tassos, soil is so important. It's not the only thing. It's absolutely part of the bigger picture. But if policy does not address soil and ensure that soil can play its full ecosystem role, not just as a medium for growing plants that are also food, then there will be points beyond which there won't be very much that policy and society can do. So it's very important at this time, as others have said, to make sure that the right measures are in place to encourage and to make sure that that soil is protected and fostered so that it can continue playing all of those essential roles for society, sequestering carbon, growing food, being a well for water, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you.
Koko, thank you. But you know, perhaps it's just me, and I don't mean to be a doom merchant, but I feel as if this conversation lacks urgency and pace. I just look at the rate of change in our world. Just if we look at the past 6 weeks, what we have witnessed on this beautiful thing that we call Earth and our planet Earth, the extremes we've experienced on our doorstep, and we continue to experience all this, and we're having a conversation that seems to appeal that it's a bit of a dance in the park, and we'll get there. And I feel the sense that actually the sense of urgency we're simply not experiencing. And I feel farmers at one end are going to feel the brunt of this, absolutely, but so will our tables and our homes and our wider societies if we don't pick up the pace. Ivo, can I bring you in very briefly to reflect on what you've heard and perhaps comment on what you've heard so far and some of the points that are being made?
Yes, thank you very much. I agree. we really have no time to waste. We are very, very late, I think is more accurate. At the same time, I can very much empathize with the position of having to come up with a policy that would actually be the right choice for 10.5 million farmers in very diverse circumstances. So I think a lot of very, very important points have been raised, and I think it really reflects the situation of very sort of well-meaning actors not really having a very, very clear path forward. Like, we know we need to act, but we have to balance these different elements of sort of farmer economic security, of looking into the future, but also thinking about the status quo. Of course, there are a lot of political and economic interests in this as well.
Indeed.
I think the issue with the CAP right now is that we're deciding it for 7 years forward. I think we have to be prepared for this not to be feasible. I think we have to be prepared that deciding on this extremely central element right now, where it is just clear we do not have the answers on how to address this, is not a good idea. If we maintain this piece of legislation for 7 years now, we will not be able to keep our goals, which are not ambitious enough. They're very ambitious, but they're not ambitious enough. So if we do this, we do not do farmers a favor in any way, where we probably doom them. At the same time, what are we supposed to do right now? It is very hard to say. I think what we need to do, and we have a window of time, in which until the CAP really comes into force. And I think what we need to do now is we need to prove what can be done that really incentivizes a regenerative, carbon capturing and low emission agricultural system that at the same time builds resilience. Tassos made an interesting point that there's a trade-off between the systems. I think it doesn't have to be, because if now we continue with a resource-intensive agricultural system, we will not be able to maintain food security. This is sort of the tale that we are telling ourselves, that we need to maintain resource-intensive agricultural system to maintain food security. The problem is, if we do that, we erode our resource base. And that means that within a short amount of time, we won't be able to maintain food security. So we need to create a system that combines sort of the best of these different worlds and sort of improves our natural base over time, even while climate change is happening. And so what I really want to emphasize is we have systems that can both produce enough food while capturing carbon, while improving resilience, and we need to reinforce those. And yes, this will not happen, from day one, but we need to start on that path yesterday. And so I think what needs to happen now is to explore feasible ways forward. And again, I believe we have a huge potential there. In a bottom-up approach where we explore ways, and we have many examples of where this has been done Europe-wide. And I know there are many examples happening with DG Agri, DG Climate, where this exchange is happening, because we already know a lot, and we need to explore that further, and we need to use the experiences of creating such a system for policy. And none of this is easy, but I really see sort of with all of the smart people in the room and all the willingness and all the clarity of the urgency that this can be done.
Thank you. I was going to end with you because it's perfect points you were making. But the reality is, it is a third of the budget. It's not future-proofed as a policy because it's 7 years ahead. We know that the unpredictability of climate change, let alone 7 years, but in a year. So things need to shift much faster than they are at the moment. Final point from one of our partners here today is Christel. Christel, you wanted to come in? Christel? Are you with us? I think you may have disappeared. Ah, no, you're back. You need to unmute yourself, Christel. You just need to unmute yourself.
Yes, okay, I think now it worked. My internet is a little bit slow. I still want to mention the national dialogues, which are planned in all countries worldwide in the context of the UN Food System Summit. And these national dialogues are really held in all countries, in Uganda, in Africa, in Germany, in France, in all European countries, to really discuss the actual situation of the food systems or some aspects of the food systems in the countries, and to discuss about solutions and recommendations and build up action plan, how to change the situation. And in the context of really looking for future solutions in agriculture, food systems, and so on, this is a very interesting approach. And this could be also an interesting view of the European Union to see how these national dialogues with which results were held in the different countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Colleagues, that's it. Time's up. I have to, wrap this one up. It is a conversation that's not going to go away, which we know. And as I keep on banging on the drum, it is a third of the budget. And on top of the fact that most of our societies across the world have been supported, both in the public, private sector, by taxpayers' money. And we know that climate change has the capacity to really have a significant impact, just like COVID, in actually creating a different dynamic in the way in which we live our lives and the impact it can have on our daily lives and our realities. So all I can say is I hope this debate continues. Let's hope there's a sense of urgency and pace as we move towards the UN Food Systems event, but also that events don't overtake us, and I hope that politicians and others see sense and perhaps look at this agenda again, because ultimately soil matters and so does agriculture. Thank you all very much for being with us. Keep an eye on our website. We have a very significant program on climate change matters at Friends of Europe, and do join us again. All it leaves me to say is thank you very much. Thank all our contributors. It's been great to have you with us, and take care, mind your distance, and see you again very soon. Bye-bye.